Good morning, dear students. I'm Bharti Kathuria Sehgal from the SD Vidya School, Ambala Kant. Today we are going to start with a new topic, reproduction in flowering plants. We have started with the topics of asexual reproduction in the various organisms in the chapter, How do organisms reproduce? Today, we'll start with the topic of sexual reproduction in flowering plants. As you all know, flowering plants are the angiosperms. We'll be studying today about these angiosperms and how do they reproduce. The events that occur before fertilization will be called as the pre-fertilization events. The fertilization will be the fusion of male and female gametes. Post-fertilization events mean the events which occur after the fertilization has taken place. So we'll be discussing in this topic the pre-fertilization events, the fertilization, and also what happens after the fertilization called post-fertilization changes. Let's first of all start with the structure of a flower. A flower is the reproductive structure of an angiosperm. It may contain either the male reproductive structure or the female reproductive structure or both. If it contains only the male reproductive structure called stamen, the flowers are called as staminate. If they contain only the female reproductive structure, the flower is called as pistillate, and such flowers are called as unisexual because they contain either of the male or female reproductive structures. But if a flower contains both male as well as female reproductive structures, the flowers are called as bisexual because it is containing both male as well as female reproductive structure. Now look at the structure of the flower carefully. The green colored leaves that you can see at the base of the flower are called as sepals. The colored whorl is called as the petals. The female reproductive part located in the center of the flower that you can see is called as the pistil or the carpel. Pistil consists of three parts. The upper flattened part called as stigma, the lower tube-like part called as style, and the swollen basal part called as the ovary. Ovary contains the embryo sac called as the ovule in which the egg cells are present, which will be fertilized to give rise to new plant. The male reproductive part consists of two main parts, anther, which contains the male germ cells called as the pollen grains, and also the tubular structure called as the filament. These two together are called as stamen. Now let's move on and discuss the structure of anther. Anther, as I told you, consists of this lower tube-like structure called as the filament and the upper part which contains the pollen grains called as the anther. Anther, when seen from inside, contains these small structures called pollen grains. Now let's discuss the female reproductive structure, which is the pistil. Pistil, as I told you, consists of three parts, the stigma, style, and ovary. Here, the structures that you can see are the ovules. The number of the seeds formed in a fruit are actually the number of ovules which are fertilized. So these fertilized ovules will give rise to seeds. The ovary that you can see here after fertilization will develop into fruit. Because these changes take place after fertilization between male and female gametes, so they are called as post-fertilization changes. After the fertilization, these floral parts like the petals, sepals, the anther, stigma, style, these all will wither off. Wither off means they'll fall. Now let's move on to the structure of ovules here. So ovules are present inside the ovary. which is present on a base called as thalamus. Let's proceed. Now let's discuss the process which occurs before fertilization. Before fertilization, a process called pollination occurs. Pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma. The anther and stigma may belong to same flower or to same plant, or they may be from the different plants of the same species. Now this process of pollination of transfer of pollen grains. So anther, which contains the pollen grains. From here, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma. Now, as you can see here, this process may be taken place with the help of some agencies like birds, butterflies, honeybees, wasps, humans, bats, and many other agencies. In other than this, there can be the wind pollinated flowers which can be pollinated by wind. There can be water pollinated flowers which can be pollinated by water, and many other different kind of agencies are involved in this process of pollination, which is, again I'm telling you, transfer of pollen grains from the anther. Anther is the male reproductive structure. From anther to the female reproductive structure, the receptacle, the upper part called as stigma. This process will be called as pollination. Now, pollination can be self-pollination or cross-pollination. If pollination is taking place in the same flower or in the same plant, it is called as self-pollination. But if it is taking place between two different plants, then it is called as cross-pollination. For the purpose of pollination, the beautiful flowers that you see, the beautiful fragrance that flowers have are basically to attract the insects and other pollinating agencies to carry out this process of pollination, which is very important part of the process of reproduction in flowering plants. As it is occurring before fertilization, so this is called as a pre-fertilization event. Now, this is what we were discussing, self-pollination. If it is between the same flower or on the same plant, it will be called as self-pollination. But if it is occurring between two different flowers of two different plants, it is called as cross-pollination. Here you can see a bee, a honey bee, which is sucking nectar from the flower. Now the nectar which is produced is also again produced to attract the insects so that they can perform pollination. Now let's discuss the structure of pistil in detail. We've already discussed about stigma, style and ovary. Inside the ovary is present the ovule, as I told you. Ovule contains 8 nuclei but 7 cells. That's why it is called as a 7-celled 8-nucleated structure. Actually, there are 3 cells at the bottom, 3 cells on the top, out of which the central cell is called as the egg cell. The 2 are the synergids. On the top, you will find the antipodal cells, and in the center of this ovule, you will find the central cell. Each antipodal cell, synergids, and egg cell contain one nucleus each. But the central cell contains 2 polar nuclei. So because it contains 2 polar nuclei, the number of nuclei increases to 8, but the number of cells remains 7. So this embryo sac thus is called as 7-celled 8-nucleated structure. Now, the integuments, the coverings that you can see around the ovule will give rise to seed coat. I told you this ovule after fertilization will develop into seed, and the integuments that you can see around will develop into the seed coat. Let's move on here. to the post-fertilization changes that I was talking about. So this ovule will turn into the seed. The ovary will turn into the fruit, and the seed will contain embryo, which is actually the fertilized zygote. So during fertilization, when pollen grain falls on the surface of stigma, it germinates to produce a pollen tube. The pollen tube moves through here, through style, and goes inside into the ovary and reaches towards the embryo sac, where it releases two pollen gametes. One of the pollen gamete fuses with the egg cell and forms the zygote. This zygote, which is formed inside the ovule, will then give rise to this embryo. And this embryo is what we call as the miniature plant present inside the seed. So when you see a germinating seed and see a green colored structure coming out, that is actually the embryo which has started coming out after the breaking of this part, which is called as the seed coat. Now let's discuss about the germination of seeds. You must have seen these small plantlets arising from the seeds. They look beautiful, isn't it? When the seeds start germinating, the cotyledons that they possess, cotyledons are the part of the seed which are the reserve food for the seed plant. So actually you can think over it when you think of a ग्राम सीड. तो आप एक चने के दाने को इमेजिन कीजिए जिसमें ऊपर का जो ब्राउन कवरिंग है वो है उसका सीड कोट. अंदर जो चने के दाने के बीच में जो चने की दाल जैसे दो स्ट्रक्चर्स हैं, दे आर कॉल्ड एज द कॉटिलिडन. और जब आप चने को भिगोते हैं और उसके अंदर से जर्मिनेट करके जो निकल रहा है पार्ट, दैट इज कॉल्ड एज द एम्ब्रियो. Now here you can see that when a dicot plant starts growing, the cotyledons come out and form the leaves, because cotyledons turn leaves and start performing photosynthesis. That's why they are called as the first seedling leaves, because by then there are no leaves developed, so they start the performing the function of photosynthesis to provide nutrition to the growing embryo. So just look at this beautiful picture in which we have shown a bean which has started germinating. Now, when it starts germinating, it gives rise to two parts. The part which gives rise to the root is called as the radicle, while the part which gives rise to the shoot system is called as the plumule. So here, the plumule and radicle will give rise to the shoot system and to the root system. In the case of a monocot, the cotyledon does not come out. Rather, the plumule and the radicle come out of this cotyledon itself and start developing into a new plant. That's all for today. Thank you so much. Keep sending me your queries. God bless you all.